What's going on, y'all? KMBest here, and oh my god, I'm coming down with the Techno-Organic Virus! Techno-Organic Virus frenzy is sweeping the nation. While many people are obsessed with Mother Ascani, Techno-Organic Virus offers a different take on the metagame. We've previously been in very combo-heavy metas, and while both Gambit decks and the Captain Carter combo decks are still trying to go over the top of you, a lot of experimentation is being put into what is the best points and tech core, and Techno-Organic Virus, which was previously nowhere near the metagame, is now starting to move into that upper echelon. A lot of reasonable and interesting stuff is being done with this card because of its ability to repeatedly buff cards that would otherwise have a downside. This lends itself to good point output that can then be backed up by tech, but that's not all that Techno-Organic Virus can do. So let's take a look at 8 Techno-Organic Virus decks that are succeeding right now for some really good players in High Infinite. First up is the one that I've been playing the most of. This list came from Butt, and I made a slight modification, swapping Cosmo out for Mobius M. Mobius. This is a deck that is looking to do point output and rely on Mobius and Shadow King as good reads against what the metagame is really trying to do to you right now. This deck will live and die by how good those cards are and how much they're able to prevent your opponent from engaging with what you're doing. This is a deck that can do a lot of point output, though. There are a couple of really cool interactions, like if you have a Mobius and you Mother Ascani your Techno Virus down to 0, it'll just stay at 0, and so will all the copies, and you'll just be playing 2 Techno Viruses a turn. There's really powerful tempo plays like Debris, and the ability to duplicate a Shadow King off that Ascani is nothing to sneeze at. Effectively, this is a Supergiant-ish deck that has said that the Supergiant package just isn't what this kind of deck is looking for right now. I would rather just have more points and play for Mobius and Shadow King as my relevant tech cards than be a Negasonic deck. And the point output here is really dramatic. The first version of the virus you play is going to make everything +1, the next virus +2, the next virus +3. This is a card that can really output a ton of power. If you're Mobiusing, that's 3 virus outputs up to 9 power on every lane for a very small energy investment. That is a really serious threat. And that threat is what's allowing this deck to contest a lot of things with just the point output that it has, and be able to be a good reactive deck with the tech that it has as well. Because the virus, well, that's ongoing power. Your Shadow King isn't losing you anything. Another virus deck that's taking a totally different angle on the card is the Husky Puppies Techno-Organic Virus list. This list is playing it much more like a bounce deck. And I think that this is on here largely to demonstrate the total difference that you can get in the Techno-Organic Virus space. There's so many differences between the builds of these decks and what their goals are that I think a video like this should help people understand what people are trying to do. The goal of the previous list is to have good point output and rely on tech to make sure that your point output is bigger than theirs. The goal of this list is to go as maximal on point output as you possibly can. You want to be playing this as a Black Swan bounce deck, effectively. That is realistically the thing you're trying to do. One little bit of tech that you have access to is that you can activate a Black Swan before removing the ability that Techno-Organic Virus does, which will enable you to play a Techno-Organic Virus for free on the final turn of the game. That is a very powerful thing to do as long as you order it correctly. This is a solid point output deck that is built much more towards I am going to go taller than you. Inasmuch as these decks have weaknesses, a lot of them boil down to 2 cards, Killmonger and Gambit Horseman of Death. Killmonger, luckily, is not a card a lot of people are playing, but if these decks pick up, it might seriously become an issue. Gambit Horseman of Death is a card that you will have to be painfully aware of. Interestingly, though, the best tech card against those lists is not actually Armor or Kyera. It's just playing a Mobius so the Gambit deck can't get anything onto the board that actually activates their Gambits without paying full retail for it. That's the other thing that Mobius is doing in all of these decks. He's great for your own viruses to remove the additional cost scaling, but he's also great against the stuff that is particularly hard for you to see. Another direction that you can go with Techno-Organic Virus is playing bigger, chunkier guys as your tech pieces to make it just a little bit easier for you to output points and to generally be a little bit less vulnerable to Gambit spam. This is also the deck that is able to interact with your opponent in different ways. Being able to be a Cosmic Ghost Rider deck, being able to be a Stardust deck, these are not tech cards that the Archetype typically has access to, and having access to them will win you some games that you would otherwise not really be in the range of. I do think that it's possible this deck also ends up going the Mobius route, but when you're playing much bigger guys, your virus is a little bit less of a focus. This is a deck that has a lot of interesting ways to interact, and what will ultimately determine whether or not it ends up being the right kind of point output is how it matches up into the other virus decks. Right now, the matchup does feel like it's a little bit in the favor of this deck. They're just a little bit bigger at every spot along the curve. Their demons that come off of Shadowlands Daredevil are potentially quite powerful, and the only real downside you run into is that it's really bad to Cosmic Ghost Rider in the mirror basically every single time, and the mirror is fairly likely to have a Mobius, which can be a little bit awkward for you, but isn't gonna be that bad. When I've beaten this deck with the other lists, it has usually involved Shadow Kinging Ares and Daredevil. That is a powerful play, but largely I do think that there's a lot to be said for building this deck a little bit differently, a little bit bigger, and a little bit more able to interact in ways that are not necessarily the ones people expect. If you start following that line of logic, you can end up with the list that Rora made. This is a Scar-based virus deck, where the real thing that Virus is doing here is just being reverse Sauron. That's really all he's really here to do. Why did I gender a virus? She, sure, they, it. That's what it's here to do. The point of the card here is just to get rid of the ability on a star brand. That's really all you're trying to do with it. Sometimes you'll be able to with extra energy of some kind, or maybe not necessarily extra energy. If you can get him down to 3 cost, you can get your Wilson Fisk to 10 power, and that will enable him to also trigger your Scar. And then you're just going to play points. And that's really, if this deck, again, a lot of the questions for these decks are, how much interaction do you want to have? What interaction do you want that to be? And how willing are you to just be like, I do not care, I am going to go full points. And I think that if there is a mistake in this version of the list, it is largely that it eschews the interaction that is actually really good right now, things like Mobius and Shadow King, and actually makes itself a little bit vulnerable to them. This is a deck where there are going to be some Shadow King targets from your opponents. They're going to be able to hit that Ares. There's a Mobius target. That's what that Scar is, just sitting there, just doing stuff. And I do think that if there is a failing here, it's that the theory, I think, behind this deck is that I'm going to be the bigger version of you. I'm going to be the one who isn't running the tech, and the tech isn't going to be very effective against me. And I'm not sure how true that actually ends up being. But I will say that playing some 10s is really solid. 4 10s, though, a lot less solid than 1 12s. And I think that's the thing that I run into when it comes to this build. When you're doing this sort of thing, a 410 isn't actually all that much better than the output that the deck is getting otherwise. And I think that's the biggest thing that makes this sort of fall a little bit short compared to the other lists we've talked about, is that like a 410 used to be much bigger than a lot of things, and now it kind of feels like if I play, Debris and a Virus the turn after I played a Mobius, guess what? I'm also getting 10 power out of my 4 energy. This is the most played version of Virus in Infinite on Untapped, and I think I'm a little bit suspicious of it. There's a couple of card choices here. Ebony Maw is cool, and I like the theory. The idea with Ebony Maw is that in these mirrors, I am going to have a 7. The other cards are going to be 6s, so I will have my Wilson Fisk, and they will not have Wilson Fisk. And I don't think that's a bad theory, but it's also a really terrible card if you don't play it early. And you have to play it early with a 0, or with a virus, and if you're not doing that, you're just in tons of trouble. The other thing is Adam Warlock. Whenever I play against these lists, it's like, okay, I don't hate the Ebony Maw Adam Warlock thing. You get your Fisk down. That's super cool. Here's the problem. Those want to go in the same lane. So when are you actually going to get rid of the abilities in that lane? And it's like, oh, that doesn't actually work as well as I would want it to work. The Adam Warlock thing, I don't know. I've seen people doing Adam Warlock, Shadowlands, Daredevil, and it's cute, right? Like, I like that you're drawing cards. I like that your Daredevil's going to be really big. It's a reasonable thing to do. But when you have a deck like this and you're just like, here's my points, here's what I'm doing, I think it might be a little bit of a miss to be investing in Adam Warlock as opposed to investing in a card that will actually help win you the game. Like, I don't just want to be like, Adam Warlock sucks, you should never play him. Ebony Maw sucks, you should never play him. But there is a reason why we don't tend to go that far in decks very often. And I think normally I would say the answer is the juice just isn't worth the squeeze. It's not that it doesn't work. It does work. It's just not worth doing it for the times when it does work, when it's so bad when it doesn't work. Hammer's Virus is a pretty cool list that I think does a couple of unique things. Because the hammers themselves key off of card names, if you virus Bill and Thor, they're still going to be targeted by Mjolnir and Stormbreaker. And that's a pretty cool little interaction. This is sort of spiritually pretty similar to the Husky Puppies build, where what it actually is like functionally, it's like a bounce deck, right? Like that's really what's going on here is I'm just doing a bunch of point output on the final turn of the game, or maybe it's more analogous to like an old school Sarah deck. But unlike a Sarah deck where it's like, here's my discounts, I'm going to vomit a bunch of points thanks to my discounts, you are not so nearly dead to Mobius as they are, and that is a relative advantage in a metagame that I think is swiftly trending in the direction of Owen Wilson being in a lot of decks. This is a list that can do a lot of power. It is also a list that can be pretty freaking vulnerable to Gambit copyings. Again, this is why we kind of have to play Mobius in here. The armor is helpful in that world, but being realistic, against the Gambit decks, it is way better to have a Mobius than an armor because it will just limit the amount of times they're able to do that to you. It is quite important to have access to that. Now, the downside, though, is we are a deck that cares about zeros. So the things you're going to be really wanting to protect with your armor are those zeros, especially if you put points on them. Like your final turn could look something like Stormbreaker, Mjolnir, virus that location, then armor. Like that's the kind of thing that you might want to do if you're running into Gambits a lot. You're going to need to be aware of that being a particularly powerful card against these kinds of strategies. And that is definitely something to pay attention to. I think that generally speaking, you are also able to protect yourself from other things, throw priority meaningfully, make Shadow King not amazing against you. That's all really good too. You got to think about what you want to protect with that armor, though, because it could be the zeros, it could be a Hitmonkey, it could be a Thor, it could be a Bill, but it's going to have to be something, I think. And that's a very real thing. Where this deck falls short, I think, is that I don't actually get the sense it gets a lot out of playing armor during the course of its nut draw. Like, this is a deck that really wants to go Thor, wants to go Bill, wants to go Jane. When am I actually playing the virus? Better be sometime other than the final turn of the game. Like, obviously, it doesn't always work that way. But there is enough sort of expensive stuff in here that you end up a little bit more in the Smiz virus space where like there's some chunky boys and you might not necessarily play a lot of viruses every game than you are in one of the other lists. Like the butt virus deck is just, I'm spamming viruses. I'm playing them all. I'm playing at least 3 viruses every time I draw the card basically. And this is not necessarily that kind of deck. Two Fastos interactions to talk about. The first one is that Fastos can reduce Shadowlands Daredevil demons to 0. If they are in the deck, they can then get drawn by Jane Foster. The second is that it will always reduce Techno-Organic Virus to 0 if Virus is in the deck, because it can't actually get power, so we'll always choose the other one. This will also make Virus drawable by Jane Foster. We've sort of run the gamut of Virus decks so far, so I think it's probably time to talk about the most minimal investment you can make in Virus. This is literally just Virus as backwards Sauron. There is not a lot of I'm playing a lot of Viruses here. None of that is happening here. Virus is in here to be a 1-cost card that you play 1 time per game and remove the ability from your stuff with. And then you are, in theory, just going to have way more points than your opponents, because your opponent is playing Virus stuff and you are playing the world's most giantest big guys. Unfortunately, by virtue of being a Scar deck that is also relying on cards like Shadowlands Daredevil, you do end up vulnerable to the popular tech cards Mobius and Shadow King. And generally, if you're building one of these decks, what you really want to avoid is being vulnerable to those things. I think you're quite good against the Cosmic Ghost Rider, Luna, Snow, Smiz type versions. I think you're basically never going to lose those games. But I also think that you do need to be pretty aware that if the metagame trends more to Mobius, being invested in being a Scar deck is not necessarily the smartest thing to do. And now we come to the final deck in our group. Having fully run the gamut from points in tech to maximalist points, now we are here at minimalist versions of Techno-Organic Virus. The upside of this list is largely that Supergiant is still a pretty disruptive card. I don't necessarily know how much it fits with being a Techno-Organic Virus deck. Obviously, TOV is the kind of card you want to play a lot of, and Supergiant will keep it face down. But there are some really cute things you can do with a deck that has this many little levers to pull. There's some really scary stuff you can do with Armor and Negasonic. For example, you might say, oh, that's ridiculous. Why would I do that? You can get rid of the Armor by using a Virus and then put a Negasonic there that they will never expect. Is that a smart thing to do? I don't know, but you can definitely do it thanks to hiding cards face down. There's a bunch of little tricky things in this list, but fundamentally what it's reflecting is that the Virus stuff is swiftly becoming one of the best point packages in the game. And Supergiant is always about playing whatever the best point package it can. And that might just be what Virus is now. I've seen some other Supergiant lists. It could be a lot more profitable to just go the other direction, be a Ronin deck again, just play Killmonger and Shadow King and just don't worry about the rest of it. That's a profitable direction. But I think what this list reflects to me is just how much Virus's stock has risen in the world, that now that it doesn't have to compete with Shou Lao anymore. This is becoming one of the more premier point packages in the entirety of Marvel Snap. And there are still, as we've seen today, so many different ways to play it. All right, y'all. Thank you so much for watching. As always, I have been KMBest. You have been phenomenal, and I will see you in the next one.